In part, I think it really does stem from how people really just look at their pool to make the decision, right? They look at the cards that they have, and everything is so anchored on the cards that they have. People need to be indexing more into the cards they expect to see into the future and the quality of the deck they expect to get.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and I'm here with a guest today. Joining me is my longtime friend and longtime friend of the show, Ryan Saxe. If you haven't listened to an episode with Ryan before, you're in for a treat. There's some of my faves. But these episodes come about usually by Ryan bringing us through some thoughts about how he sees magic maybe a little bit differently than a lot of folks, maybe seeing things a little bit more of a mathematical, analytical lens, showing you how you can see the game a little bit differently, and of course, how that translates to you winning more, drafting better decks. But before I get to that, I have to say, hello, Ryan. How are you doing?
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's good to see you back. It's been about a year or two since the last time you were on, and like I mentioned, always a treat to have you on. We have got quite an interesting one today. I'm really excited to record this one. So the topic that Ryan has brought to us today, kind of think about, muse on, massage your brain a little bit, inject this into your magic ethos, your core of who you are as a magic player, is prediction. The topic of prediction and how that's key to being good at drafting and at gameplay. Before I go any further than that, Ryan, what do we mean by prediction as it applies to magic?
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty broad topic. Right? I think this might be one of the broadest that I've maybe even been on to talk about. Mostly because my own life philosophy is that everything is pretty much governed by prediction. All of the actions that you take are about predicting what will happen after you take the action or the things that lead up to before it. Regardless, to me, what this really means is the following. Magic is a game of closed information, right? You don't know your opponent's hand. You don't know what people are about to pass you. Closed information, I guess, is not the right word. I think in technical terms, this would be called a game of partial information.
Mm-hmm.
You know some of their cards, you know their board, you know your hand. Similarly, you know your pack, you know what you've taken so far, you know what you've passed. Regardless, I think everyone probably agrees, I believe it's likely just true, that you could make better decisions if you had more information, not less.
For sure.
And so to me, prediction is super key, particularly in draft, but in many things, because if I can predict that closed information, right, the information that I don't usually have, and I can do that relatively well then I have more information to govern my actions, and I will probably win more.
Absolutely. And like Ryan mentioned, bit of an abstract, broad topic. So to really anchor us, we're going to be talking about something that I think most drafters know, have come across, have read about, have heard somebody talking about. It's the concept of drafting the hard way and the articles that have come along with that and the community response and interpretation of what it means to draft the hard way. Because really, when it comes down to it, drafting is about prediction in a lot of ways, predicting what you're going to see in the future, predicting, am I going to end up, given the path that this draft is taking, will I end up with a functional deck? A lot of drafting and like prediction, those skills, they really go hand in hand. We're going to, in the process, kind of dispel, I think, some misconceptions people have about drafting the hard way. This is something that I've done on the show before, probably years ago at this point. So it's not brand new ground we're breaking, but I think it's a really good lens to view the skill of prediction through. So what we're going to be doing today is kind of just talk about, some ideas around drafting the hard way. This episode was actually spawned from a Twitter thread that Jean-Emmanuel Depraz, JED, posted on Twitter. His whole thing was kind of just like, well, if people think drafting the hard way is outdated, the idea of it, then they probably don't actually understand the core ideas behind drafting the hard way. So that's what we're in for today, training your skill of prediction in Magic and using the concept of drafting as a way to illustrate a lot of these concepts. Anything before we get into the meat of things that you think people should know going into this, or anything to prime them with?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'd like to kind of start with is if I think of my own content that I've created, right? In many times I've been kind of like a someone against drafting the hard way, but I even wrote an article about drafting with preferences, about leaning into your own biases in some degrees. There's been many, many, many articles that are like, drafting the X way, right? That tries to make their own take on it.
Yeah.
And people also know that I'm a big proponent of forcing as I've said on the last time I was on this podcast for this topic, at the right time with the right mechanics. That being said, what I do want to say really is I do actually believe in the ethos of drafting the hard way. And I fell into that own trap of really seeing drafting the hard way as a synonym for staying open. For me, what I've realized now and what I'm excited to really talk about is staying open is actually just an application of the concepts in drafting the hard way.
Yeah.
Right? It's one example of a thing that you can do embodying that philosophy that leads to relatively good decks on average. And I think what I'll leave listeners with to ponder over before we get into the real meat of it, as we're about to kind of just go over the article, when you expand the notion beyond staying open in many ways and you start leveraging the idea of prediction, a bunch more falls out. I think I'm going to make the argument. I don't know if I will. We'll see what happens in the podcast. I think I'm going to end up making the argument that actually drafting the hard way at the right time actually is a foundation for forcing in itself. I think many things that we do will be when you take this lens of prediction and kind of put it on top of the philosophy or ethos, as you put it, of drafting the hard way.
And just before we jump in, do go on and shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. You can go there if you like the show, like what we're doing here. You want to support it, you want to see keep going. Plainly put, this is the number one way that you can support me or any of my content. So if you do want to support, if you want to check out the benefits over there, check it out, patreon.com/limitedlevelups.
3, 2, 1, let's go!
Okay, so let's get into it. And I think a really great idea to kick us off on is, Ryan, what is the misconception when people look at drafting the hard way? Like, what do people get wrong about it in your view?
Yeah, so really, as content creators, right, we know that application pieces seem to hit more than theory pieces. It's easier, just general, or maybe hit more is the wrong way, but it's easier to get into people's minds. And so for me, when you have an article like Drafting the Hard Way that is really about like some philosophy, at the end of the day, people need an anchor. They need something where they understand, okay, but like, what does that even mean? Why do I care? And the easiest example is really staying open. And so it's led to sort of this divergence over time from like the actual article and the true meaning, where those two things are used as synonyms. And to give just like sort of a clear example to me, drafting the hard way is really all just about the simple idea that context matters. Okay, it's that different formats require different drafting strategies. Different archetypes require different priorities. The way that the people behave around you may govern your draft in a way that's different than your last one in the same format. All of that is context that leads you as the drafter to make different decisions. And drafting the hard way was about opening people up to that. But the easiest application of that is it kind of ends up being stay open, right? It ends up being, okay, I need to be open to changing things, because if what other people, like if I'm starting blue and white and the person to my right is blue and white, well, hopefully I didn't draft in a way that screws me, right? That's going to happen often enough that you want to kind of draft in a way that can mitigate your ability to train wreck. And so that kind of requires you to consider the context of all the things that you see and quote unquote, stay open. Just take good cards, because this other thing can happen. You'll be able to pivot out of it. You'll figure it out later and you'll be good, right? That's staying open, but that's not drafting the hard way. What that is an application of drafting the hard way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'm going to post the JD thread in the comments and the description of this podcast, just for those who want to read the whole thing. It's a really good Twitter thread. But one of the things that really stuck out to me about that thread, and I think how I really see drafting the hard way at its core, is don't draft lazily. Which is to say, whatever strategy you're employing, which if you're, one end of the spectrum being extremely flexible, extremely open, the other you're like hard forcing, neither of those, we can kind of agree, is optimal to do all of the time. And this is going to change in different formats, in different stages of different formats. It's going to change within the drafts that you're in. You're going to realize, oh, I shouldn't be forcing this deck if that was your plan going in, or I shouldn't be being completely open for XYZ reasons. What this really comes down to, and being a good drafter in a lot of ways, is just every step of the way, don't be lazy about it. Don't just lock into, well, I'm doing this now. This is kind of my strategy. You need, like Ryan said, the context. You need to take in the context of, it could be, a plethora of factors. It could be how early are we in the draft format? If we're really early in the draft format, I'm probably going to be a little bit more like, yeah, here are the good cards going in that I predicted were going to be pretty good. I'm going to try to draft those, rather than being like, well, seems like nobody's drafting green. I guess I should move in there. If I've got a bunch of great black and red cards, what does that matter? Right? The context could be, like I said, could be a variety of things. But one of the core things that I think we want people to walk away with from this episode is that you can't predict without understanding context first, right? So you need to intake all of these factors that, we're probably going to be touching on, so that you can then predict what you're supposed to do in that given draft.
Yeah, and to go back, I'll maybe address some of the things that you said at the end related to prediction in a second, but I actually wanted to focus a little bit on this idea of don't be lazy.
Yeah.
And again, because I think it's so easy to communicate what we're trying to communicate today wrong, where people come away with the exact same, like drafting the hard way is drafting open again. And I think if you really anchor in this idea of don't be lazy, let's take a step back. Like, what is it to be lazy? What is it not to be lazy? Right? All this is about putting actual mental effort, putting energy, figuring things out. And what I'll say is that doesn't necessarily even need to be at the literal second right now during the draft. When I think of all the times that I've forced, okay, that I've sat down and I go, you know what, I'm going to be, within the Jeskai pairs. That's not lazy. That's not even a subset of it's not like that's 30% effort because I'm only considering 30% of the archetypes.
Yeah.
In fact, usually that happens because I put a massive amount of energy across my last 20 drafts to have context about all of the different ways that you can draft those strategies. So there might be like 10 different versions of blue-white while there's 2 different versions of every other deck that can push me towards something like that. And similarly, all of the context about like, hey, blue-white has been open 9 out of my last 10 drafts. Seems like people aren't drafting it. That updates my context from previous drafts. So that effort, that don't be lazy, it's actually like even outside of an individual decision. And so this is where, like, to me, there's this, the fact of the matter is, and this is maybe one of the most surprising things that I'll say during this episode, but I actually believe that the philosophy, this context-dependent philosophy that the drafting the hard way article is really pushing for, or at least that's my interpretation of it, it actually supports the notion of forcing, but not lazily, not sit down, decide what you're doing. It is about really spending a lot of time, effort, and mental energy to come up with a strategy that makes sense given the context that you have.
Yeah, for sure. One thing I get asked a lot is, how do you learn a draft format? And that could mean, a couple things, but I think usually when people are asking me, it's like, how do you get to the level of comfortability in any given format that, that I tend to do as a drafter? And a lot of it is just playing a good handful of drafts and giving me a lot of the context that Ryan was just talking about, right? Like Ryan said, sometimes noticing, wow, these colors are very underdrafted. Nobody's really touching them. Maybe I'm going to start to bias towards that direction. And that's not blanket advice. I'm not trying to state that as blanket advice. I'm just trying to use that as an example of, well, here is a factor at play that I've noticed about this draft format. I should adjust because of that. And that adjustment is kind of like a new rule for me for the draft format. You might see it as being rigid and being like, oh, you need to, you're drafting this way because, for whatever reason you feel like you should. And that's a rule I've kind of imposed on myself. The rule might be, it's a format with a bunch of value creatures in it, right? A lot of creatures that come in and say, draw a card on them to some degree. Well, then I kind of say, okay, well, I'm learning that, I should probably devalue removal in this format a little bit, right? Especially because people are spending super high picks on removal spells, but they're actually not that important to winning a game of Magic in this format. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about with context here. And so I think, to build off of Ryan's point of like, what, don't be lazy, what does that mean? I think really it comes from getting as much context as you can, being informed. This doesn't mean you have to watch infinite content or anything. It just means from your drafts that you have, participated in, what's some information that you can can grasp, like from your deck. Say you didn't have a very successful deck. Why wasn't it successful? In Foundations, for me, one of the things was I realized early in the format, I need to play more expensive cards because the cheap cards in this format are not amazing and you get flooded very easily. That was an adjustment I made based on context, which then pushed me to biasing away from drafting aggressive decks. And my win rate started to go up past that. So just to set the stage here, that's what we're talking about when we say context. And again, that is even just like a sliver of context. There's so many other contexts you could be considering.
Yeah, and as well, two asides. One, does not sound like Foundations would be my kind of format.
No, I don't think so. It's not a Ryan format.
And two, this actually leads to maybe a tangent, but one that I'd like to share because I think it's good advice for people.
Great, yeah.
When you when I think of how I draft a new format, many people who have consume my content, who would watch my streams when I was playing Magic 3 years ago or whatever it was when I stopped, they'd find me like I'm the person who was known for like losing a ton at the beginning of Battle for Zendikar because I was drafting 10 MDFC decks because I wouldn't pass them. Okay. Everyone said Blue Red was terrible in Midnight Hunt, so I just like tried to figure out what was good and then I spammed it. And for me, that none of that was about my win rate. It was about building context and understanding things. And advice that I can give to people who want to do that, you can actually do that without all of the additional content creator effort that I just said, where you're forcing Blue Red to learn about it or trying to get all of this data on a new card type. The reason I did this for MDFC is because I was like, this thing has never existed before. I don't even know if my heuristics or intuition about it are close to right. The thing that I want to say actually is the easiest way to get more context in your brain at the beginning of a draft format is to pay more attention to your opponent's decks than your own when you play.
For sure.
When you play Magic, you have one deck and you're going to play 7-9 matches with it. And if you're only evaluating the cards that you cast, you've now missed 9 other decks that you could have learned about, right? Yep. You could have probably consumed information about almost every single card in the format. And I think most people don't do that. And so they end up learning much slower about a format and leaning more on the stats of the format because they're missing 90% of the data that they could have in their context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I that's something that I'm sure I've said multiple times before. I'm sure you even said it on the show before. And it's something that even if you've heard before, I think, I'm guilty of this too. I probably don't even pay as much attention as I should to my opponent's deck, even though I do pay a good amount of attention to it, right? Like, I think that is somewhere that I know I can grow personally, and I would assume that everybody listening out there, I would be shocked if there was anybody who's like, nope, I'm paying full attention 100% of the time to what my opponent's doing, what their deck's doing. I'm sure it's something that everybody can improve, everybody can tap into this resource in a lot of ways, this of giving you more context of something that you don't need to draft 20 times. You can kind of cheat on those numbers by like looking at what your opponents are doing. One of the things that I like to do when I do paper drafts at my set review partner Mark's place is go over the decks at the end, right? See what my opponents were drafting. We do a full deck breakdown. When we were doing like Pro Tour testing, we make sure we go through the decks and really break them down. But even when we're not doing things that seriously, I like to just see like what people's ideas were, why they drafted the colors they did, why they included a particular card. Why was that your 23rd card? And you can really get nitty gritty with the people that I draft with pretty often, because these are people that are super invested and know what they're talking about. You're not always going to get that environment at a local game store necessarily, but the idea stands that I always recommend gameplay review when looking at like how to improve, and just going on 17 lands, looking at your gameplay logs. Sure, find your own mistakes, but also figure out what the opponent was doing and what they were up to, and again, why they were playing the cards they were playing. maybe interesting interactions that you didn't come across. So yeah, just like if this context, like gathering context, seems intimidating to you, there is a ton of places that you can get the context from. It's not just content or whatever deck that you drafted.
Yeah. And so to kind of pull this all together here with respect to forcing, open, drafting the hard way, you can think of there's two different types of context. There's the format context that you're learning from playing those games, reading articles, looking at statistics, all of those different things. And then there's the draft context. What options do you have in front of you? What have you passed? If you're in paper, sometimes like this has happened. I'm at multiple pro tours where like, oh, I know that team drafts this way and they have 3 members in my pod.
Yep.
Right? Like there's a variety of different types of context, but most of it can boil down to like format level information and sort of the distribution of the draft type information. And there's some bleeding there, right? Like there's the main ways that those two things interact is like the density of different archetypes. Like if 100% of tables have a blue-white drafter and 5% of tables have a blue-black drafter, that's something that kind of bleeds across both because that affects gameplay. But overall, the main point is that there's context in the draft itself that you're gathering. There's context about the format. And if we pull that back to sort of this drafting the hard way and where staying open kind of ended up almost consuming the point of the article, which let people to miss this, is the article drafting the hard way is about context. The way that people think about drafting the hard way is just the in-draft context. They forget about the format context. They forget about all of that other stuff that can lead them to not be fully open. Oh, green-white is really, really bad in this format. I'm not even going to entertain it, or I'm only going to entertain it when I, get past this crazy green-white rare. So now I know the person feeding me is hard avoiding it, and fine, maybe that'll bolster it enough. The point being is a lot of the misconception, I believe, almost I think it's important to address that just saying it's about context doesn't solve that, because there's a huge part of context that is how drafting the hard way got misconceived as this staying open. It's about that sort of draft table dynamic context that pushes you towards staying open. But the other thing that's pushing you the other direction that ends up being, as I said, like in certain points, I'll force. In many ways, it's a function of two things that'll pull me away from staying open. It is very specific context about the actual draft format itself, what's good, what's not good, and my prediction before I sit down of what people are prioritizing, what is the distribution of what other people think are good. Because if I believe that what's good is not what other people think are good, right, then I have this format context that I can abuse because I'm going to get the good cards that people are passing them later than they should.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think just one more thing to hammer this idea home, that context is really what Drafting the Hard Way, the article, is about. In that Ben Stark article, he says quite a few things that directly contrast to the idea that the optimal way to draft is just to stay open. He says things like, understanding that blue is very bad in this format, just to give an example, like that should pull a lot of weight in your decisions. Like Ryan was saying, like knowing that maybe other people are going to avoid this color combination, green, white. And that's just like so much help in predicting what that draft is actually going to look like. You have to know that you're drafting with people that do know that, right? More going to work in higher level pods, and if you're drafting your local games with people rather than just random arena draft. But even on your random arena draft, I think you can still apply that, because I think at this point, data is a big point or a big part of how people draft, whether that be directly looking on 17 lands or using a draft tracker like Untapped that gives you like the numbers, the breakdown. People are tapping into the collective unconscious some way when they draft most of the time these days, even newer drafters, from what I've seen. So knowing that, hey, there are factors that will directly push you away from being flexible, and that is the right thing to do, I think immediately dispels the idea that Drafting the Hard Way, the article, is about staying open.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't know if things have changed, but I can definitely tell you when I was streaming, and I was forcing something, like, it was very clear to me that the community, at least at the time, really had those two things as about as close to synonyms as you can get.
And people get kind of squeamish about it, to be honest. Like, I'm sure you've kind of, you must have experienced this, but I've experienced this too, where I've had, a certain format where, I just feel like Innistrad Midnight Hunt is one of the ones that really sticks out to me as me. And I know famously LSV really grappled onto the fact like, hey, blue black is great. And it's, you can support like 3 drafters at a table, even if, 2 other people know it's pretty good. And for whatever reason, people didn't pick up on that, didn't latch onto it for a good week or two. And I was really just, coming as close to forcing a color pair as I think I've come. And I'd open like a green bomb and I wouldn't take it. Right. And that would really throw people off, being like, that card's great. Why aren't you taking that? And, I'd have to explain exactly why I was forcing and the context that was in. But I think just like it's almost a sacred cow in a lot of ways, being like, well, you have to stay open, draft openly. It's okay. Don't feel uncomfortable going into a deck that you feel like is underdrafted, or you have some context for why you're drafting this deck. It's not, you're not breaking some fundamental rule of drafting. In fact, Ben Stark, if you had sound logic, I'm sure would agree with a lot of the reasoning you might have.
Yeah, and like all of this, literally all of it, whether you're staying fully open or whether you're forcing or whether you're just drafting to draft, doesn't really matter. It really all does come down to some degree of prediction. In fact, and I've said this, I'm probably said this even on this podcast before, but probably actually I'll bet in either the forcing or the picks to path episode, I've said, the fact that like your pool might be empty, but it's not actually empty. Like like when I sit down to draft, when you think about that blue black example in Midnight Hunt, like how many organ hoarders were already in your pool before you even took the first one?
Yep.
Like at the end of the day, approximately 2, 3 were going to be opened, and you were probably going to get at least one of those just because of how that card was prioritized. And so fundamentally, like what caused your decision, LSV's decision, a variety of other people to actually make the correct decision to over-index there, it's not that you weren't even open. It's like you just started the draft with like 2 Diregraph hordes and 2 organ hoarders in your pool. And like if you start the draft with that, even if you abide by the philosophies of staying open, you end blue-black.
Yep. That's exactly it. Yeah, you kind of already know those cards are going to make their way to you. But that, and that's the kind of context we're talking about. You have the confidence that that's going to happen. Okay, so that was a lot of abstraction. We've really laid out kind of the groundwork of what we want to talk about here. Don't worry, if you're getting a little bit lost, we are here to give you concrete examples from here on out. So what we're going to do is talk about context and prediction. Again, remember, the thing we're trying to train with this episode is your predictive skills, and those predictive skills come from factoring in context from different places. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a few scenarios where you have context and you can make a prediction. We're going to talk about looking at a set before you even play it and figuring out, making some educated guesses of what might be good, what might work. This is something that content creators do all the time. And I would suggest that you out there looking to get better, looking to win more drafts early on in the format, get that leg up on the opponent, I would really recommend that. So we're going to talk about kind of looking at and analyzing a set. Then we're going to use the context of being in a draft and all the things that you can consider just actually when you're in that draft, how are you using this idea of context leading to prediction. Then we're going to talk about gameplay. So exact same thing. What's the context we're working with? How can that lead to accurate prediction? But let's just start with set context first and looking at the card file and going, what's going to be good in this set? What does that mean? What are the cards I'm supposed to be on the lookout for? And I want to throw it back to an example from a few years ago at this point. Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, the D&D set. And there was a very, very, very prominent deck in that set if you played it. If you haven't, Red-Black Sacrifice was the big thing. And the thing with that deck, and Active Treason, the Active Treason variant, whatever it was, don't remember the name anymore, that was the top common in the format on 17 lands. People were winning with that card. When that card was in their deck, they were winning a lot with it. And the context there was a lot of really good sacrifice outlets in that set at common. I think there was about 4 or 5 good ones just at common alone. So, yes, after playing the set, after about a week, and the 17 lands data came out, people could see, okay, well, the steal and sack thing seems to be pretty good. At least, I think that's the next level analysis. You're not just going, well, active treason is just good in this format. No. I think most people are going to be like, oh, there's something going on here. And that something going on was, like I mentioned, the black sacrifice cards were really, really strong. Now, could you have predicted that based on just looking at the card file? Ryan, you didn't play this set. Am I correct on that?
I don't actually so I stopped playing after Neon Dynasty. That's what I would have drafted almost every set before then. Was that before or after?
I think it was the summer of, if I remember correctly. So I don't think you played this one.
So probably didn't, or I might have done a draft or two. I was still I still do every now and then. Kind of regardless, the question of, I think, so you asked a question of like, could you have predicted that? And first I want to say, like, the answer is always yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Could you have? Absolutely. Like, if you had like the most brain power possible and spent the most time sitting and staring, it is within, there's not like new information that comes from drafting and playing. Do you understand? Like, drafting and playing yields data that's generated from that card file. Everything is a function of that card file. So right. Everybody had the ability to make that prediction, but I'm assuming nobody did. You could probably even go back on like tier lists and see where people put active treason.
For sure.
So for me, the real point is like, we all had the ability to, but basically nobody did. And so and a lot of that's because generally the way that people interact with card files is like, let's rate every card. Right? I don't even know what the scales are anymore. Is it still A to F, or is
generally people use the A to F letter grade. Right. That's what I still use.
So people go and they go over the set and they rate things, and generally you do consider some degree of context when rating cards. Like, okay, like what does this card do in its archetype? White blue is a flyers deck, so like maybe you consider that when evaluating different flyers. But most people don't really go deeper than that. And even myself as a content creator, when I made different tier lists from card files, I didn't go much deeper than that. But the fact of the matter is you can. You can look at so many different things like density of removal, size of creatures. If you break, I don't know if you've done this, but when I was like playing Magic 80 to 100 hours a week, whenever a set came out, I was like building deck skeletons.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, right? I've done that.
And so like building deck skeletons is like a great way that you might have been able to come across this red black deck if you just like built it and you were like, wait a second, this looks like way better than all the other skeletons that I built.
Yeah.
However, to do that, you would have had to build the skeleton with the active treason to begin with. And like in many, many ways, the active treason historically has been bad. So you need to also be willing to like question and change your own what would it be called? Predispositions, understanding?
Yeah, basically.
But when I'm looking at a card file, and the format that I did this probably mostly for was War of the Spark. If you remember, there was a War of the Spark Pro Tour, I believe, that was before the set was even released.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so like I started making content that was like this. Like how much can I predict about the format from the card file? The two formats that I know I've done this for, by the way, is War of the Spark, in which case, by the way, I was very wrong. And what is it? Kaldheim.
Yeah.
No, not Kaldheim. Kaladesh, the original one, in which I was very right. Actually, as a fun fact, that is why I got hired at StarCityGames.com to begin with.
Oh, wow.
So like when the vehicle card type came out, I just like sat with the entire set and was like, what does the existence of this vehicle mean for the entirety of the format? And I wrote this giant article that I don't even think exists anymore. It was on some random site that been taken down. So it might not even be on the internet anymore. Maybe someone can find it, where I made just a bunch of predictions that all turned out to be true about Kaladesh. And I wrote other articles and stuff. But so the main point is like, I sat down with that format, with that card file, and I said, okay, what are vehicles? Let me imagine a world where vehicles are good. Let me make the assumption that people are going to want to put vehicles in their deck. Okay, what does that mean for these other cards? Okay, like Fabricate can create your vehicles, and you start going down like this path, this chain, where like, kind of going into Kaladesh, I was immediately under this like Renegade Freighter is not a reasonable comment. just from that, like sitting down and doing that for Kaladesh.
By the way, for those not in the know, Renegade Freighter was a 3-mana crew 2 vehicle that was a 5/4 trampler on attacks. So very, very pushed for a common vehicle.
Yeah, which, I mean, it happens because that was literally like vehicles didn't exist yet. But the point being is, I guess for me, when I talk about context before you even start with a format, and I've said this on this article, on this podcast before, and I've said it in my content, like I almost always, going a step deeper than just your tier list is about asking yourself those questions. Imagine a world where X, right? Imagine a world, in this case, for the example that you gave for that act of treason, like imagine a world where black is really strong because sacrificing things are good. If you anchor yourself on that context when you look at the entire rest of the format, a bunch of things will fall out that you didn't even realize.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is a good practice to go through a few of those for every set, right? Imagine a world where, in this, like imagine a world where that act of treason is really, really good. But you also want to imagine a world where, like, let me look at some other commons, right? Imagine a world where this one is good. For, again, these are old examples because these are when I drafted a lot more, but like the example that I give for this is something that Christian Calcano directly said to me, which was, imagine a world where this red aura is better than the red common removal spell that was instant speed, which was like unheard of at that time. But once you imagine that world, it changes your evaluation of every single card in the card file. And sometimes when you do that, things click into place.
And this all sounds like extremely experimental. Like, what does this actually matter? When you get into your draft, like, does all this thinking actually matter? All this taking in the context. And, especially because, you just mentioned with War of the Spark, you thought something was true. And then you're like, oh, no, I was completely wrong about that.
Yeah, just so other people know what it was, because I was really off on this one. I thought the amass mechanic, I thought the fact that like generating a small amass token and then your larger amass cards effectively having haste because of that token, I thought was going to be really meaningful.
Right. Yeah, I remember that. I remember you saying to me one day, what do you think about the 4-mana blue that it amasses 3?
It ended up being so bad.
It was really, really bad. Yeah. But that's the kind of thinking. Anyways, you know what? It didn't matter. Actually, sorry, that's not true. I was going to say it didn't matter that you were wrong. It actually mattered a lot that you were wrong, because you went in with a hypothesis and you tested it, and then you were like, oh, actually, those aren't the factors that play at all here. And if you didn't go in with just like having potential realities that could exist for this set, you would be a lot less primed to realizing what was actually true about the set, right? There's kind of this school of thought that's like, I've heard some people be like, I don't like looking at the set at all before I go in, and I like just going in blind and just playing the cards and seeing what cards are good, what cards aren't so good. Totally works for some people, and I don't doubt that is the best way for some people to do it. If they're trying to get the biggest leg up, they don't want any kind of anything that isn't just their play experience clouding their thoughts. I personally, and I know Ryan also, prefer to go in with some sort of hypothesis, because then when we are wrong, we can then go, okay, well, that's totally okay that I'm wrong, but I understand better why I'm wrong and why the things that I thought to be true aren't working out. And I also understand, now that I have this more context of, oh, that thing I thought was true isn't actually true, I can better understand why the good things, the things that are good, are working, are actually successful, and why I should be drafting those decks, and how much I should be fighting for those decks, and also what I actually need for those specific decks to work and function. Like, what we're getting at here, that hopefully has been hammered home multiple times, is the more context you get, the better you are when you actually get thrust into the draft portion and need to predict, how am I going to get the best deck possible? Well, all that thinking you've done before can really, really prime you for that.
Yeah, 100%. And like that's all drafting is, right? You're just trying to maximize the deck that you get at the end. And that's why while you draft, like a lot of that is about like predicting what your final deck will look like, but your ability to do that with more context is better. In fact, one of the things that I'd say about doing that work kind of ahead of time from the card file perspective is what this is an example of, is it sort of two things. One, the difference between exploration and exploitation, right? So generally speaking, like we're talking about trying to behave in a way where you build that context, and not all data is created equally.
Mhm.
If I sit down and I draft with the exact same assumptions every draft, the exact same priorities every draft, I never change those and I don't pay attention to my opponent's deck, I literally can't possibly learn a context that leads me to something optimal.
Right,
Okay.
right.
I get stuck at whatever I'm currently behaving as and so like one, you need to be open to changing your mind for any of this to even matter. And two, when we talk about the beginning of the set, this is why in a lot of ways, I purposefully am just trying to try stuff out to learn about it, to try and figure out different things. And, one of the things that comes up from my like what I do for a living, right? Which is, for those that don't know, I build machine learning and AI models, whatever. Not all data points are created equal. In fact, if I have the exact same data point twice, it doesn't give me any new information.
Mhm.
And so there's this whole idea when you're talking about learning. Sometimes there's even a space called active learning in what I do that is about like trying to if getting data is expensive, which here it literally is, you have to pay for a draft.
Yeah.
By the way, okay, literally costs you money, and you can only do so many. There are algorithms for doing different things purposefully so that you get more. So that your data points are different enough so that they're more informative, so that you learn better, learn more efficiently, and converge quicker on a format optimum. I know that's a little abstract, but to me, coming up with these imagine a world where ideas from a card file and trying them out is almost exactly doing that. Let me assume I'm going to behave at the optimum if this were true, and do that with like 5 concepts over different drafts. I'm going to learn a lot.
That's going to transition us really nicely into the next thing we want to talk about is when you're actually sitting down in the draft. So you start with the context of, maybe your first draft of the format is a day or two in. Maybe you've listened to a podcast. Maybe you read an article. Maybe you watched the stream. You got a little bit of an idea of what's going on in the format. You're not a master or anything, but you're not starting from zero. And also you just read the cards, of course. What context are you looking for aside from okay, before I've cracked my pack, I have an idea of what's going on here. This is this could be a whole episode in itself. So I don't want to give you too tough of a question here, Ryan. But what are some of the factors that go into this model we're talking about context and predicting where you're going to end up? Actually, the answer might just be Ryan's Picks to Path article and podcast that we've done. Would you think that's actually kind of accurate?
I think that's a subset of this. We'll talk about a little bit more, but I love that article. It's one of my favorites. But first off, I want to say, just so you have it directly from the podcast side, you can choose to leave this in or not. Don't give me too long of a rope here, because I could just talk forever.
Yeah, no, for sure. Don't worry.
But so the first thing that I have to say when I think about these things is actually directly about format context, and why, for me at least, even for my first draft, going through that card file is so important. Now, I'll be clear. I enjoy actually not having that information for my first draft now when I'm not playing competitively or anything. I think it's fun, but I think also it's less productive. So
Right.
If I'm trying to optimize how quickly I can converge on doing something really, really on basically, if I'm trying to maximize my win rate over the course of the format, I will read that card file. The main reason there is basically, I think that if the less context you leverage, you're by definition regressing to the mean. Because you don't have no context, okay? You've been playing Magic for however long you've been playing Magic. You've drafted however many different sets that you've drafted. It's not like you're sitting down even for your first draft with a blank slate. You're not. You have the context of all of the different formats you've ever played and what has been good in all of those. And effectively, when you don't look at the card file before you sit down, and then we'll get into what you're going to do is you're going to regress to the mean of the context that you have of all of your prior formats, because it's not conditioned on what you're doing. So for me, this is one of the reasons why I'm such a large proponent of forcing, not because forcing, and there's a whole podcast we did on that, right? Not because forcing is the best thing to do. It's very often not, but it's like the epitome of conditioning your draft on some very, very large priors. And for me, conditioning drafts on priors is one of the things that I find most interesting. Okay. Anyways, for the different parts of draft context. For me, it actually directly starts with prediction. So if we recall earlier, I said things like the reason why it was correct for you and LSV and others to force is because when you sat down, your pool wasn't empty. Okay, your pool already had these top commons because they weren't being prioritized by other people.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the context of the draft that you're trying to build your context as you draft. But all of it is, it's not for a random reason. All of it is to give you a clearer picture of what your final deck looks like.
Yes.
Because if you know what your final deck looks like, you can always make better decisions. Take the example of not having 2-drops. Okay. If I'm in pack 3 and I have no 2-drops, I'm going to probably, unless Magic has changed in the last 2 years, I'm probably going to prioritize 2-drops.
Yes, I would agree. That has not changed.
So, but if you're able to predict what decks generally look like, you may understand like, oh, like black green in this format, like my ability to predict it before I sit, right? There may be like 6 different 2-drops that I can play, but like only one of them I actually want in my deck.
Right.
Okay. And so like when I sit down and I predict what my deck looks like, especially after I start accumulating black-green cards, like my prediction has those 2-drops. They have to, otherwise my deck's going to be bad. And I understand that. And as I go longer and longer and longer without that specific common 2-drop, okay, my prediction of my deck quality is going down.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that very simplified example, a lot of the context that I might be trying to build is twofold. One, what are all of these other people around me doing with respect to black and green? Because I may need to pivot out at a certain point if I'm conditioned on something that I don't have.
Right.
So like I may, for example, in this example, I may purposefully bias, let's say that a 2-drop is green. So I know my black-green decks are going to be heavy green generally because they're going to need to cast that 2-drop because they don't want any black 2-drops. So like the way that I'm going to draft is first off probably leaning green more so because I'm going to want an off-ramp possibly to other green decks, let's say. So that's like format context in draft navigation. And then when you pull it back into like, what are you reading, right? You're reading things around like the what's being fed to you about like what's in the different packs to tell you how you need to govern towards, you know, that best deck that again you're trying to predict. So that's sort of like step 1, just to summarize, because I think I rambled a little bit, is to is to be able to predict your deck, have that prediction be conditioned on what is good in the format from what you already understand. At the beginning of the format, that prediction, by the way, is just going to be like any reasonable 2-drop, removals, mid-range cards, value, etc., or particular synergies that you know from sort of, we talked about deck skeletons a bit. You might understand black-red is about sacrifice, and what does that mean? That's going to govern your prediction of what things look like.
Yep.
And then what you're trying to do is collect 2 pieces of information at the same time from the table. One is based on everything that you're seeing, you're constantly changing that prediction. If black is drying up, okay, my prediction of that deck is becoming more and more green in this green-black example. Okay. And, you know, if you as you constantly kind of monitor that, it actually starts telling you that it's time to pivot, that it's time to change as you're collecting information from like what you're seeing in the packs. So what you see, reading signals is one, but I also think what you send matters too. I understand that most people say that like, oh, you should only care about what's being fed to you, not what you send. But like fundamentally speaking, if I pass a rare and I believe the person to my left is going to take it, and I do not believe that the format can support multiple drafters within, let's say, within red-white, if I pass a red-white rare, like that's important context for me. It's not just about what I see. It's about what I predict the table is doing. Again, this is about prediction, but my prediction is actually my own context. Do you see?
You can definitely view this under the lens of the prediction is the thing that causes the context, or the context causes
this is why, actually, this is a really, I rambled a lot to get my own head to this point, but this is why prediction matters as a skill for drafts specifically. When we talk about like draft is such a difficult and a difficult thing to do in many ways, right? It's a game of partial information. Okay. And the context I'm going to have is very, very limited. I just know what at the end of the day, all I know is what I've seen. And that is based on some random distribution of what cards were generated in packs as well as what people did. But I only get a very loose idea of what people did in terms of like things that are explicitly confirmed. If I have perfect memory and perfect recall, then when the wheel comes back, I can know exactly what was taken. But that doesn't actually necessarily tell me all that much. It might tell me, it can tell me a variety of things. The point being, my ability to predict what's going on at the table, the reason why that's such an important skill is because that gives me my rich context.
Right.
If I can so strongly predict, wait a second, I have a pretty good inkling that there are 2 red-white drafters at this table. That like can fundamentally change everything, and no individual piece of information I got is going to give me that directly. In fact, no piece of information is explicitly going to tell me that there were 2, unless maybe if I had a pack that had 4 red, white, gold cards and none of them came back in the wheel,
Yeah.
then you're getting something. But usually you have things that are a lot more, a lot less explicit. And so your ability to change what your deck looks like, and this becomes even more relevant for impod play for those that are playing on the Pro Tour and everything. Like, let's say I have this strong inkling that 2 red-white drafters are at my table. That might actually change what a winning deck looks like.
Yeah.
And so like that, my ability to predict that based on the information that I have, as well as the context of the format, the quality of red-white, etc., possibly how good my deck is against red-white. Again, this is an in-pod example, but it's the type of things that people really forget to think about now that so much is being played on Arena. But like that actually changes what's good, and your ability to predict what other people are doing, that funnels back into your context in a way that the literal examples of what you've seen can't. It can't in a salient way.
Yeah, just to give you one more example of this, and one thing I think, just as far as just the very practical very practical thing you can take away from this is something Ryan said a few minutes ago, which is you want to know what you're planning for your deck to look like by the end, and that could be how many 2-drops you need, what specific 2-drops you want for this color pair, how much removal is good for your strategy slash the format you're playing, right? All of these things. And these are all things that you should be forming an idea of as you play the format more, like what is successful, what ratio of these things lead to a successful deck. And as you're drafting, just keep on going, well, do I think I'm seeing these things? And like Ryan said, the further you go through the draft and you're not seeing those things, the more likely it is that you're not going towards a successful deck and you should do something else. And I'll give you a really good example. This happened to me quite a bit in Duskmourn with blue-red. Because blue-red was, the room deck, which is more of a control deck than not, I would say. But for me to have a successful control deck, you need quite a few things. You need inevitability, which you can get that from multiple different things, a rare, card draw. You do need some card advantage, and you needed, I'd say a good pile of removal spells. 6+ for your control decks is what I'm looking for. And I had a few drafts I can remember from Duskmourn where I started maybe even with a good late game rare, and I went into blue-red. And as I was going through the draft, by the time I got to the end of pack 2, I wasn't close to the number of removal spells I needed to support a good control deck. And so because of that, I went, well, if I didn't see what I needed in pack 1 and pack 2, I can probably predict that I'm not going to see what I need in pack 3. In fact, my pack 3 would have to be phenomenal and have to be extremely lucky to get to that number of removal spells that I need, that I deem to be acceptable for a control deck. So what I should do to veer towards a more successful strategy, or a strategy that will lead me to a more successful deck, is take this deck in a little more of a tempo direction. There is a Piranha Fly. The 2/1 comes in tap flyer. That's a card I played multiple copies of in those decks a lot of the time. As I realized, hey, I need to shift to something else because my control deck isn't going to work out here. I need to actually focus on killing my opponent. So that's the kind of way that this can all play out in real time. Ryan did a really good example of just like talking out all the factors, but that's how, if you're having a little bit of trouble mapping this onto the actual draft, that's just one example.
That's also such a good example that like links back to things that we've previously said, right? Like that example that you gave, in my opinion, is so much about what drafting the hard way is about, and has nothing to do with forcing, staying open, or whatever. You've already picked your two color pair, right? But it's all a function of your prediction of what your final deck looks like, your prediction of the quality of that deck, and like the game you have to play in your head to like, oh shit, let me I have to re-optimize my deck now. What does that look like in a reasonable way? And you need to be able and accept. You need to be like open to change. And in many ways, like that might have even started slower. Like, oh, I'm like at the end of pack 1 or beginning of pack 2, like, oh, I'm starting to get like a little in risky territory here. You could even like, based on that context and knowing that that's risky, that can actually inform your picks before you even make that decision. Let me take, card A because it's going to work in either blue-red direction. I haven't picked one yet. I really want to be control, but like, let me not end up screwed if I don't end up seeing this before my pack 2 wheel.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly, I think if you were to take anything away from this episode, it's kind of what the last 5 minutes were, like what I said and then what Ryan said in response there. Because I think a lot of people, when they get into that risky territory, their plan is hope. Their plan is like, well, I know this isn't going very well for me, but I've kind of made my bed already. I have to sleep in it. I don't think that's true. I mean, there are some drafts that are harder to navigate into a good place than others. That is definitely true. This isn't something where it's just like, wake up, dummy, just don't draft that way. It's not going to work like that. But if you're aware of your agency to be like, things aren't going my way, what do I need to do to get to a functional deck? I think that is a huge, huge skill that most people just overlook and maybe even don't think about.
And in part, I think it really does stem from how people really just look at their pool to make the decision, right? They look at the cards that they have, and everything is so anchored on the cards that they have. People need to be indexing more into the cards they expect to see into the future and the quality of the deck they expect to get.
Absolutely. And I mentioned that we were going to talk about gameplay, maybe a little bit of 17 lands. We're going a little bit long, so I don't want to get too deep into that.
Yeah.
But just quickly, because I think it is good to lay out like what we mean in reference to gameplay.
So gameplay is good because we can be quicker about it. For me, prediction is still super, super involved in gameplay, but it's involved in a bit more of a directed way, in my opinion, in the sense that like there is very clear like hidden information, right? What is in someone's hand? And so to me, a lot of prediction boils down to, or I guess what is in their deck as well. Based on the actions my opponent has taken, what is the likelihood of what cards are in their hand and what cards are in their deck? Mm-hmm. The cards that are in their deck, that's a function of your format knowledge more than anything.
Right.
What is in their hand is a function of what they have played so far. Okay? They played whenever an opponent, just concrete example, and then we'll move on. Whenever someone like passes without playing something on turn 2 and then plays a 2-drop on turn 3, right? One of two things. They had something at instant speed to do that they felt like they wanted to hold up on turn 2, or they just drew that 2-drop.
Yeah, I use this all the time. This is a really great example. Yeah.
But so like fundamentally, all that does is that updates your prediction immediately. Because you understand like what's the different likelihoods of this, and what is the you can literally calculate if you wanted to what is the likelihood that they just drew that 2-drop versus it was already in their hand. So anyways, gameplay has a variety of different things that you can where the optimal decision downstream is probably a function of the context you have on the format, the actions your opponent has taken, and what that means you predict is in their hand, right? And everything else related to gameplay here is more about how it funnels back into that format context, which is about learning. And I think we've covered that kind of in depth earlier in the episode anyways.
Yeah, for sure. So like we have been saying throughout this episode, this is a bit of an abstract topic, probably one of the more abstract episodes we've put out. But if you're looking to be like, I think we've done a pretty good job of giving you some concrete examples. But the essence of this, to really like, so you don't have to listen to this episode 7 times and be like, oh yes, like I missed that part the first time. The essence that I would take away from everything we've talked about here is just it's a 2-step process of intaking some sort of context, whatever that is. And context could be many things. Like, be flexible in what context means. It could mean context of your specific draft, the cards you have, the time, what week you are in on the format, like all these different things. And then formulating some sort of plan. Like another way to put this all is like, that the classic Magic have a plan. That all comes into this in a lot of ways too. Intaking as much as you can to make the best prediction possible of where you're going to end up. And that's a lot of just what Magic is at its fundamentals.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And that's the action. What, like, if I were to try and say, like, what do I believe people are not doing right now that they can do after listening to this article, this podcast?